Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise and to speak to Bill C-47 at report stage. I want to share some reflections, particularly about the process that the bill has followed through its journey in the House of Commons and some of the debate that's arisen today on the subject of the bill. So I apologize that the thoughts aren't in any particular order, but I think there are some things that are nevertheless worth noting about the bill. I think if you were to listen to the debate today and you're a Canadian who hadn't studied the bill, you might be under the impression that the recent increase in the carbon tax is somehow in this bill. I think it's important just to say that it's not. I think there's been a fair bit of confusion around that given the focus of the debate. You might also think that a lot of the major spending items that the government committed to in its budget are in this bill, or you might even think that this bill is the budget itself, given the nature of some of the conversation that's been had around the bill. And I think it's important, again, to distinguish between the budget itself, which was already debated and voted in this House some time ago, and then budget implementation acts, which don't always legislate commitments from the most recent budget. In fact, sometimes they go back to previous budgets. But effectively, when the government is ready to move on some previous budget commitments and there's legislative work that needs doing, that's what you see in the Budget Implementation Act. So there are some items from the most recent budget in this act. There are some items from previous budgets in this act. One of the things that I think is important to emphasize is that as far as spending authority goes, that is actually this bill giving permission to government to spend taxpayer money, there's not anywhere near the level of spending in this bill that some have made it out to be. So for instance, even in respect of the dental program, this bill does not authorize the money for the dental program. It does have some legislative measures to facilitate the program ultimately once it's ready to be operationalized, like better sharing between government departments of information so that they can ensure that people who are making claims under the program are properly eligible. So in other words, there are some provisions designed to ensure eligibility up front, to move away from the attestation system, something that Conservatives have said that they don't like in terms of the attestation system, that there should be upfront checks of eligibility so that people don't mistakenly receive benefits that then have to be clawed back. That is something that this legislation seeks to do. This legislation reduces the excise tax increase that was going to be 6.3% because it was tied to inflation through an automatic escalator down to 2%. That's not a spending item. It's a reduction of government revenue because it reduces a tax. It reduces a tax that Conservatives said they wanted to see reduced, and takes on a tax increase that they thought was inappropriate in the circumstances. We agreed with that as New Democrats, and we're glad to see that small brewers and small vineyards across Canada who are facing difficult times aren't going to be hit with an outsized increase in the excise tax. But that's only true if this legislation passes. This legislation also closes a lot of loopholes in tax and other law that are used by money launderers in order to avoid paying taxes and to mask their criminal activity. This bill cracks down on predatory lenders or payday loan places that are charging really inordinate amounts of interest that are making it hard for, Canadians don't typically choose a payday loan center as their first choice for banking. It's usually because they don't have a lot of options, and that's how they get there. And somebody had shared with me a statistic. I think it was something like just by walking in the door of a payday loan place, Canadians are 40% more likely to end up declaring bankruptcy. So there's clearly a close connection between payday lending and people on the financial margins. This seeks to do something about that by lowering the criminal rate of interest. It also improves the Canada Workers Benefit, something that a colleague of mine on the Finance Committee likes to talk a lot about, the marginal effective tax rate for working class Canadians and how it disincentivizes people to leave social assistance for work. That's his claim. He likes to reference a C.D. Howe Institute report to that effect. In fact, the changes to the Canada's Workers Benefit would help reduce that marginal effective tax rate and make the transition from social assistance to employment markets easier. The legislation also removes Russia and Belarus from a list of countries that get preferential tariff for trading in Canada. In other words, it extends and strengthens sanctions that Canada has put in place since Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. These are the things that are getting held up. And they're not getting held up because there's another huge spend that goes along with this. In fact, the biggest spending items in this bill were the doubling of the GST tax credit and $2 billion in health transfers to the provinces that was negotiated between the federal government and the provinces. That was by far the biggest direct spend in this legislation. And with the consent and participation of the Conservatives, all parties in this House expedited another bill, C-46, that had those spending items in it. So now there are some coordinating amendments in this legislation to make sure we don't do the same thing twice. But the fact of the matter is the biggest spending items, with the full participation and knowledge of the Conservatives, have already passed through the House of Commons. And what's left are a number of some administrative changes to set up the kind of administrative infrastructure for the growth fund. And as I say, some legal changes to facilitate the administration of a dental care program. But this isn't actually where the money is being authorized. You would think that a former finance critic, which the leader of the Conservative Party is, you would think that he would know that. You'd think that his current finance critic might know that. Perhaps the finance critic for the Conservatives might have known that had he bothered to show up much at committee during the whole C-47 process. But apparently he had other things to do. He left it to other members of his caucus to hold down the fort while the Finance Committee was studying Bill C-47, to the extent that it did. Of course, we didn't do as much extensive study as I would have liked to do of that bill because Conservatives chose to talk out the time we had. First, they talked out the time we had to hear witnesses, and they did that in the lead up to the Minister of Finance's appearance. On a grand principle, I'm not sure. Did they have an important point? I think so. It's one that I've supported on the record many times. I thought the minister should have committed to come for 2 hours. As it was, she came for 1 hour and 40 minutes, but she only told us she would come for 1 hour. I do not think that was helpful to the process. I think that more forewarning by the minister of how long she was actually prepared to appear would have been more helpful. But in the end, what that meant was that the Conservatives chose to talk over all of the time that we would have had to hear from Canadians who are concerned, stakeholders that represent various concerns. And then there was an agreement at the committee to have a process to move to clause by clause that would have allowed us some time to have debate of the clauses and various amendments and sub-amendments. And instead, Conservatives then chose to talk through that time as well, because then they said they wanted to hear from witnesses after talking through all the time we have for witnesses. They say the agreement that they signed onto with the Liberals to do clause by clause provided for another 10 hours of witness testimony that they never got. But did they raise it when we still had 3 or 4 days to hear from more witnesses and to come to an understanding? No. They raised it after all the time to hear from witnesses had elapsed. So they knew when they raised it that there wasn't going to be a positive outcome, that they weren't going to get what they wanted. And then they've repeated this kind of behavior in the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question and commentaire, the honourable member for Milton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the speech from my colleague from the New Democratic Party. For most of the evening, we've been hearing, some pretty fanciful stuff with respect to climate change and previous Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's efforts to abate acid rain, which was historic and so important. However, the way that that former Prime Minister worked to deal with the issues of the time have been stretched a little bit. Of course, he and the president of the day, George Bush, used things like cap and trade and changes in products used to produce electricity. I note that the province of the colleagues' home province is Manitoba, where they generate almost all of their electricity through renewable resources like hydro and wind. And most of the members who are so against carbon pricing are from provinces that still generate a lot of their electricity from coal and natural gas, like Saskatchewan and Alberta. Currently, over 80% of the power from those provinces are from fossil fuels. Perhaps the member from the NDP could comment on how carbon pricing is an effective measure to move provinces more towards renewable resources to generate electricity.
For Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I certainly think that carbon pricing is one piece of the puzzle, and it's meant to be a kind of market, a market tool. By putting a price on carbon, you incent companies to come up with more ways to try and get carbon out of their supply chain, so that they can offer a more competitive price, and folks will be more likely to buy cheaper products, and so you're rewarding companies that have a lower carbon supply chain. That's the idea. It wasn't originally a left-wing idea. It was a kind of right-wing idea designed by folks who are on the political right, but nevertheless accept the reality of climate change. But one of the things that I would remind my Conservative colleagues in all of this is that the oil and gas industry in Alberta was built with a lot of public funds and a lot of upfront public investment, and in fact, a lot of public investment continues to go to the industry. Which is why we know that if we want to shift the economy somewhere else, that too will require a lot of public investment.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had a lot to say about the previous speech on royal titles, but I'll focus on the subject matter of the speech that was just given. In terms of this issue of carbon taxes being a market mechanism, or whether it's a market thing or not, I think the important point is that, of course, they involve the possibility of incentives and trading, and they recognize those realities. But fundamentally, what it is it's a tax. That is, it's requiring Canadians to pay more, intentionally driving up the price of gas and the commodities that have gas as an input, making those things more expensive in an effort to incentivize changes in behavior. The fact that the carbon tax increases prices for Canadians, that's not a bug, that's actually the intention of the policy. So I wonder if the member will just acknowledge that in his support for this policy and the NDP's support for this policy, they are seeking to promote the increase in gas prices, that they want higher gas prices, and that's why they support a carbon tax.
Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I would note that New Democrats are quite firm in our belief that as we look at the record profits that oil and gas companies have been enjoying, that we don't think oil and gas companies should be able to walk away with that money and pay it out in dividends to their shareholders or squirrel it away in international tax havens, but that there should be an appropriate tax applied to oil and gas companies. And we, of course, have also been open to the idea of having some kind of public utility board that would regulate the price of oil and gas, because we recognize that long before the carbon tax, a long weekend was sufficient enough reason for oil and gas companies to jack up the price of oil and gas. And we think that Canadians ought to be just as concerned about the advantage that those companies are taking of Canadians in their basic pricing structure, never mind what's added in tax. So there's a larger conversation to be had about how you get fair pricing for oil and gas. I think that the Conservatives' kind of monolithic focus on the carbon tax obscures a lot of ways that Canadians are getting screwed at the pump by oil and gas companies themselves in order to outsize their profits.